Blockchains are supposed to be completely decentralized, right? No leaders, no central control. So who actually makes the decisions? Upgrades don't just happen by magic. Someone, somewhere has to agree. We're constantly told the system is fully distributed, but as you'll see, influence definitely isn't. Some folks write the code, some validate it, some vote on it, but only a very select few actually shape what survives in the end. So when a blockchain changes, who really decided that? Well, blockchain governance, it isn't quite what you think. Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to decode the illusion of decentralization.
You know, you probably think you're in total control of your digital assets, but the very moment you click buy, a massive hidden system steps in and starts deciding pretty much everything. It completely shatters that illusion of a purely distributed, leaderless network. Because control isn't always something you can just see on a dashboard. Sometimes it's subtle influence, it's off-screen coordination, and these invisible forces that steer the whole ship, while the rest of us think it's just running on autopilot.
But before we dive into the deep end of how this all works, a quick note. This explainer on the channel Block Spawns Funds is created for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute financial or investment advice.
All right, let's get right into it. Part 1, the 4 layers of control. Who actually rules the network?
Okay, to really understand how control operates in a supposedly leaderless environment, you have to look at the system in layers. It's kind of like a giant stacked puzzle. First, you have the protocol. That's the code itself. But hey, code doesn't just rewrite itself, right? Second, you've got validators and miners. They're basically the enforcers who decide which rules actually matter on a day-to-day basis. Third are the developers, the architects proposing the big changes. And finally, social consensus, the broader community. Literally every single decision made on a blockchain has to navigate through these 4 major bottlenecks. When you look at how this architecture is stacked vertically, you can see the exact flow of power. It's fascinating. Decisions start all the way up at the user layer, they filter down through DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations in the application layer, and eventually they hit the protocol layer at the very bottom. So sure, theoretically anyone can submit a proposal, but the actual implementation of those changes, that gets squeezed through some very specific, highly concentrated funnels.
Take Ethereum, for example. If you want to change how Ethereum works, you need an EIP, an Ethereum Improvement Proposal. Anyone up there can draft one, but then it enters this intense off-chain discussion phase. If your idea actually survives that gauntlet, it falls into the hands of a relatively small, highly specialized group of core developers to literally write the software. Now, they don't exactly rule the network like kings, but as the architects who are facing serious resource constraints, they have immense agenda-setting power. They are an absolutely critical bottleneck for what gets done. Moving right along to part 2, the power of whales and how financial power really operates in DAOs.
So we're shifting our focus from the developers who write the code to the token holders who actually vote to approve it. In traditional democracies, we're used to power being distributed by one person, one vote. Pretty straightforward. But in these decentralized autonomous organizations, governance is almost entirely token-weighted. It's one token, one vote. This essentially creates a tomocracy, which is a system where power is directly tied to your wealth. Basically, the larger your wallet, the much, much louder your voice.
The numbers behind this are actually pretty wild. According to research on whale dominance, the moment the top 10 holders own more than 60% of a token's supply, the centralization risk hits an absolute critical level. Think about that. At that point, a tiny, tiny handful of people possess basically unilateral decision-making authority. And this isn't some rare anomaly. It emerges totally naturally from early investors, founders, and huge venture capital firms just holding on to disproportionate chunks of the supply.
To put that into perspective, the reality on the ground is staggering. When researchers analyze voting outcomes across major DAOs, they found that the top 10% of voters control roughly 76% of the voting power on any given proposal. That means the remaining 90% of the entire community is fighting over a tiny 24% sliver of influence. So, despite having this beautifully decentralized open source architecture,
The actual decisions, they are heavily dominated by a few massive players.
Now, what's really interesting about this is looking at real-world examples, like Yearn Finance. This is a major DeFi protocol that literally attempted a completely fair launch, meaning no pre-mined tokens for insiders. But even with that perfectly fair start, 50% of the active token supply eventually ended up controlled by just 21 accounts. Just 21. If those folks decide to send a couple of texts and act as a unified whale pod, they can completely steer a multi-million-dollar project. It's just a natural byproduct of tokens trading out there on the open market.
Now, DAOs aren't blind to this. To combat voter apathy, a lot of them use something called delegated voting, which is where you assign your voting power to someone else who's more active. Sounds great in theory, but instead of spreading power out, it often just funnels massive amounts of votes straight to top delegates through these really opaque networks. It opens the door to some pretty exploitative stuff too, like vote selling or what's called strategic non-participation. That's when top delegates purposely skip controversial votes to protect their own reputations, all while quietly manipulating the outcome behind the scenes.
Which brings us to part 3, social consensus. What actually happens when the network breaks? Okay, here is the ultimate test of decentralization. What happens when the community completely disagrees and there are literally billions of dollars on the line? We tend to think of blockchains as just pure, cold, on-chain execution, automated smart contracts doing their thing. But the most powerful layer of all isn't technical whatsoever. It's off-chain governance. It's the incredibly messy, very human, social consensus happening in late-night Discord channels, Twitter debates, and developer video calls. And when that social consensus completely fractures, well, we get a hard fork. Think back to the infamous 2016 Ethereum DAO hack. Tens of millions of dollars were just siphoned away. The community was totally torn down the middle. Do we alter the immutable history to get the money back? Or do we stick to the principle that code is law? The disagreement was entirely irreconcilable. So what happened? The network physically split in two, giving us Ethereum and Ethereum Classic. There's a brilliant quote from researchers at Cyber Capital that hits the nail on the head. They point out that traditional democracies usually avoid civil war after elections because we have a solid social contract based on measurable voting. But in blockchains, they note that, quote, social consensus lacks any such mechanism for avoiding disruptive conflicts. Without formal conflict resolution, a blockchain practically has no way to prevent these brutal, fragmenting civil wars, other than just slicing the entire network in half. Let's pull back and look at the big picture in part 4, the decentralization paradox. This all leads us to a pretty profound realization. Fred Ehrsam, one of the co-founders of Coinbase, put it very bluntly. He said, governance is the most vital problem in the space. See, blockchains absolutely have to evolve if they want to survive, and evolving requires coordination. But here's the paradox. The more decentralized a system is, the harder it is to actually coordinate everyone. And whenever you have a vacuum of formal leadership, hidden power structures naturally, inevitably, rise up to fill the void. But hey, the industry isn't just ignoring this problem. There are some genuinely fascinating experimental solutions being tested right now to try and limit that outsized insider influence. They're trying things like quadratic voting, where casting multiple votes costs you exponentially more, which severely handicaps those massive whale wallets. They're also looking into progressive capping, reputation-based influence, and time-locked voting, where you actually have to lock up your tokens for a while to gain voting weight, proving you're really in it for the long haul. So the absolutely crucial point we need to take away from all this is simple. Control in a decentralized network isn't usually centralized by design. It's emergent. It forms entirely naturally through token economics, wealth concentration, technical bottlenecks, and just basic human dynamics. Decentralized does not mean structureless. It just means the power structures are different and a lot harder to see. So the next time you're interacting with a blockchain, the next time you click buy or vote in a DAO, just remember that you are not just interacting with autonomous floating code. You are stepping into a highly complex, profoundly human system of power. The real question isn't whether a network is decentralized. It's who actually shapes the system you are trusting. Because at the end of the day, decentralized doesn't mean leaderless. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll see you next time.